Welcome to Pedagogy Power in Primary English. This is the very first episode of this vlog. And for this episode, we're going to be focusing on the Key Stage 2 SATS reading paper. Well, that was different, wasn't it? Or was it? I have a few thoughts about this paper that I'd love to share with you teachers. And I'm certain that I'm not alone when I said few. When you look at the previous test papers that we've had, certainly Key Stage 2 has given us a little bit of a gift in that those of our children who are less fluent are certainly able to read to the end. Yes, it was certainly a shorter paper in comparison to previous years. And I'm not going to go into things like numbers, comparing the number of words from 2022, from 2016 all the way up to 2022. There's lots on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter about that. People have done the data, crunched the numbers. I think it's more important that we get to the meat of the matter. What was different about this paper, if anything at all? At first glance, on looking at the questions, I was thinking, my goodness, there's hardly any multiple choices here. And then I thought, let me just take a look at the previous papers just to check to see how many multiple choices were actually in 2022 in comparison to previous years. So this is what I found out. In the 2022 paper, we had 10 multiple choice questions. This included your typical tick one, your matching style of multiple choice, a circle and answer style of multiple choice as well. However, there weren't any true or false. I do believe that there was a sequencing question. Yes, there was one sequencing question. And there wasn't any tick twos. So yeah, there was a little bit of less cognitive demand necessary in some instances of our multiple choice for 2022. So they were fairly easy in comparison to what we've had in the past. There were only 10 of them. In 2016, however, we had even less multiple choice questions. We had 8 multiple choice questions. And those 8 included your matching, your sequencing, your tick 1 or your tick 2, true or false, and your circling. In 2017, we had 12 multiple choice questions, the same as 2018. And then in 2019, we had 11 multiple choice questions. So we weren't too far off the mark, and it certainly was not the least number of multiple choice questions that we've seen appear in the Key Stage 2 SATS. Now, we know that 2019 threw a curveball at many teachers where we were thinking, my goodness, how retrieval heavy was that? In fact, we had in 2019, 42% of the questions dedicated to retrieval as the cognitive domain. Whereas 36% of that was inference, we had 6% of that being choice of language, and between comparison and summarizing, there was 2% either way, and we had 12% vocabulary and meaning. 2022, however, gave us a bit to think about. Instead of it being retrieval heavy, this time it was inference heavy. In fact, we had 44% of the questions based on inference, 38% of the questions based on retrieval. We had 2% either way when it came to prediction and content and meaning. We had 4% based on summarizing and 10% based on vocabulary and meaning. Now, none of this is particularly strange because if we follow the SDA framework that was published in 2016, it shows very clearly how the cognitive domains can actually appear on the test paper. And in fact, retrieval or inference could take up to 50% of the mark. So we shouldn't be surprised that both of these domain areas feature quite strongly when it comes to the benchmark tests. Now, paper 1, being just 479 words, carried 16 marks, of which quite a huge percentage of that was actually inference. Whereas paper 2 was around 543 words, there were 15 marks, and that one was more retrieval heavy. The final text had 541 words, and that was 90 marks, inference heavy. And it also featured 2 rather interesting 3-mark questions. Now, let's take a look at how questions and answer zones have evolved from 2016 to the current test paper. This will tell us a lot in terms of how to help children to structure their answers and give them that question analysis skill that is necessary when tackling their comprehension. So in this 2016 paper, let's take a look at the 3 markers as they present themselves. So you've got this write down 3 things style of question where we've got three items in a list that children need to identify in order to gain the marks. Okay, and then we've got this style of 3 marker where you're actually choosing a perspective and then you're writing a fully developed response, inferring and justifying from the text. We also have another box style question in the 2016 paper, once again explaining fully, referring to the text to support their answer. And in this case, this question deals with the reader's perspective. 2017, the box went away. Okay, not that that makes much of a difference. It's still several lines. And here the children are explaining 2 ways, using evidence from the text to justify their answer. Another 3 marker where they're explaining 2 features of the character in the text. And once again, using evidence to justify their answer. 2018 came along. And oh my goodness, didn't this question throw the children? When they saw the presentation of this, it all went to pots. They looked at it, they didn't know what to do with it, they didn't know where to write, and it was an entire mess. We had this style of question for 2 years straight, actually. We had this in 2018, and we also had one in 2019. By then, we had kind of introduced this question style to our children, and they were able to, you know, tackle it, I think, with a little bit more of refinement with their clerical skills. So, of course, in this style of box type question, the impression and the evidence are split. You have got 2 rows and 2 columns. They've got to give their inference in the very first column, and then they have to provide the supporting evidence in the second column. Now, if you take a look at the answer zone for the impression, you can see 1 line smack dab in the middle. For the evidence, you can see 3 lines. So it implies that really the impression needs to be succinct and to the point. And then the evidence obviously can be a phrase, words, or a sentence that's taken from the text. They also presented us in 2018 with a style of 3-mark questions that we currently see in the 2022 paper. So gone are those boxes with those several lines. Gone are the several lines as well. There's a little bit of reducing of cognitive load here in that we have got the points separated for the children in the answer zone, and they have got to break down their 2 different ways, each with justification. Now, obviously, according to the mark scheme, both for 2018, 2019, and now for 2022, only one of these acceptable points needs to have evidence. The other one needs to be a completely different acceptable point, but does not necessarily have to have evidence to support it in order to gain the 3 marks. So once again, 2019, here is that style of 3-mark question. And once again, these 2 separate sections within the full answer, where children have to give 2 different impressions. And that brings us to 2022. So 2022, it has become the standard. They have removed those columns and rows and made it a little more accessible by giving children the opportunity to write at length, giving their impressions, 2 separate impressions, and giving their evidence to justify the answer. And this style of question appears again. So 3 markers have evolved in terms of what they look like between 2016 and 2022. The 2022 version is certainly a lot more child-friendly when it comes to giving answers. At least that's what I think. And it makes it easier for children to actually develop their points and to recognize that it has to be two separate points as opposed to giving them one big chunky space where when they look at it, it's so much more intimidating. So that's a little bit of good news for us as teachers. Certainly, in the process of doing our comprehension questions, and we're trying to tackle 3-mark questions, I think using this layout is a clever thing. I think they will find that children are able to handle the presentation of this answer zone far better than they could with the columns and the rows, where writing no doubt was going all over the place, sometimes across the columns, sometimes below, and you know, making it a lot harder for them to be able to mark and assess. Using this style of question presentation with the answer zone laid out this way should be a priority for teachers when we are doing our 3-mark questions and working on inference and justification. Let's take a look at the actual extracts that were used in the 2022 paper. So we had 3, the parsnips, My Circus Life, A Traveller in Time. I believe that the subject matters of these extracts are actually a lot more accessible to many children and should pull on some kind of background knowledge for most. Now, was the vocabulary more tricky in this text than any previous years? Not necessarily. Now, let's take a look at the very first extract where the team is introduced for the parsnips. There are words here that are being used where children should be able to use their knowledge of morphology in order to figure out what they mean. You've got things like defender, midfielder that are used here, striker and goalkeeper. They should be familiar with the language of football, certainly having played it during their physical education. But of course, we have got some tricky ones, things like league. Are they picking up on what that means when it refers to the netty honeyball women's league? And also, are they picking up that the location is Launton FC, that acronym means football club, Low Road, Launton? Are they picking up that that's an address? So that's more about their familiarity with the conventions of different types of writing and what that content means for them. So we had the introduction and then the story around Veronica heading off to the World Cup tournament. Were there any tricky things for children to understand in this text? Now let's look carefully. It's quite phonetically easy to decode this particular extract. I didn't find that it should have posed too much of a challenge for children when it comes to accessing the information. But on deeper examination of the text, there were certain things that were implied by the vocabulary. And I wonder how many of our children were able to pick up on what was going on. For example, one of the questions asked about Megan, the captain, and how it is that Veronica knew that she was in a good mood. Now, mood, the language of mood, as you know, has to be inference. And children are having to determine what is shown and not explicitly said in the text. So it says, Megan, my captain, beamed at me, her face shiny and excited. Last port of call for Sherborne Sands. All aboard, who's coming? Now, how many children are going to pick up that when a question refers to mood, it's going to be looking at inference and not necessarily retrieving information that is around the evidence that's there to support the mood? So obviously the correct answer for that kind of question would be the fact that the captain beamed at Veronica, or that her face was shiny and excited. But I can imagine lots of children will narrow their answers down to the fact that she was excited. And that does not necessarily show that she is in a good mood. That's saying exactly what it is. So I can see straight away the challenge there in terms of identifying the difference between exactly what's going on and exactly what is implied. We've got to be really thinking as teachers now about squeezing out the meaning from text, looking at the tiny bits of evidence that impact on the whole language experience. How are children picking up on how inference is shown in a text through the vocabulary that already exists, and not necessarily something that's going on in their head and the picture they're putting together there based on the evidence they're seeing. That's two different ways of inferring. There is the inference that's taking place textually, and then there's the inference that's taking place from text to reader. And we've got to be ensuring that our comprehension skills include the breadth of the different ways that children can infer. There's also the question about the effect of the knocking on the door when the captain arrived. It seems like a straightforward question, and they certainly should be able to read around that. But are they familiar with the vocabulary that describes body language that implies that there is an effect as a result of an event? So obviously, it says here that before I could reply, a banging on the front door startled all three of us. They were here. Startled would be a very precise response that speaks about the effect of the knock, that they were startled. There's also the second acceptable point, which is mentioned in the mark scheme, where it says that one of the effects is the fact that they were interrupted. Now, that's definitely a deeper level of inference. It says, before I could reply. As you can see, there is a pattern here where the examiner is looking at inference within the text as well as from text to reader. So it's, what do these words infer about what's taking place as a result of the events? What does it show but doesn't quite say? So before I could reply means that she was about to reply to something and she was interrupted as a result of the knocking on the door. How many of our children are going to pick up on that necessarily? I would imagine it would be far less than those who would have said startled. The lesson is simple. In terms of what we've got to do for our practice, we've got to slow down in the teaching of reading and not rush through a text purely to get to the end. It is about zooming in on those deliberate things that the author does to create an effect, to create a mood for the reader. It is about identifying how actions affect characters and how events affect characters' personalities and their behavior. And then interpreting whether or not that behavior is positive or negative in terms of the impact on the reader. Another interesting question that came up in the paper was the one in the speech bubble, where the child had to complete what it is that Veronica was about to say. So when she was interrupted and it says, please wait, I said, panicking, I just have to. They then have to complete what could have appeared at the ellipse. Now, seems straightforward enough. There's lots of evidence around to retrieve from in order to gather what that should be. However, many children may not necessarily be aware of the role of the ellipse. How many times in comprehension do we hear ellipses being taught as suspense? There are different uses for ellipses, and this content and meaning effect needs to be taught to readers that they can be used in different ways for different purposes. Certainly in this case, I just have to ellipse. The ellipse is showing that there is an interruption of thought or of speech. She was interrupted because she turned and almost bumped into Yuri, her brother. Children need to recognize that the purpose of that is that a thought or a statement is not complete because the action was interrupted, not that there's suspense going on. It really is then about the skill of reading around. And in our comprehension teaching, we have to teach scanning with deliberation. Our children reading around the evidence that they're presented with in order to retrieve the appropriate information. I can imagine lots of children scanning all the way back to here, where it says, look after your boots, and they will look after you, and plunking in boots as an answer. We've got to teach our children that there is a certain proximity in terms of scanning for them to seek out information that's related to a key point. So there are a few lessons to be learned, even though that text was considerably shorter than those in the past. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Pedagogy Power. And I do hope you have found some of the discussion helpful, if not all of it. Do join us for the next episode. We are here every Sunday from 4 to 4:20, really quick, to the point, tackling anything to do with the teaching of English in primary. If you haven't already done so, please like and follow the Bright Eyes Education page and ensure that you get your notification when the videos premiere. We have got some amazing subject experts who are going to be a part of this vlog. And it's all about what teachers really need to be thinking about to improve their practice when it comes to the teaching of English in primary schools. Thank you so much and see you next time.